Okay, the timestamp is Thursday, June 2nd. It's 2:30 Eastern Time. And the lesson is number 30, Spirituality and Death. 3, 2, 1. Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to lesson 30. We thank you for being here. We thank you for making a commitment to your health. We, as you know, don't take that lightly. The lesson today is a doozy, which we say in a lot of the lessons, but this one really is a doozy. The topic is spirituality, faith, and death, and how this fits into our lives as we explore what it means to live healthy lives. I'm Ruth. I'm here with Nick and Ryan and Matthew today. Nick and Ryan and I are Footnerd teachers in the Footnerd Experience 2022, and Matthew is a teacher at a small Jesuit college, and he studies literature and religion. Ryan's going to be the host of this conversation today, and I want to give you a little background about his volunteering to do that. So when Footnerds graduate, or when they complete their process in the Footnerd program, which is usually around a year, we have what's called a debrief session. And the debrief session is an opportunity for Footnerds to be able to talk about and summarize their experience over their year-long process. Extremely powerful. They talk about and summarize their struggles, their obstacles, the highlights and victories of their experience. And one really important aspect of this debrief session is the part where we receive input about the content in the Footnerd Experience program. This is extremely important to us to receive this feedback where nerds tell us the parts of the content that they loved and that they appreciated and what they learned from it, but also the parts of the program where they think there are holes or there's missing content or something that needs to be updated. So this is how we constantly and quickly improve and learn together, and how we make the experience better for the Footnerds who come after us. So one specific area in Ryan's debrief session, and other Footnerds as well, noticed and brought to our attention that could be a possibility for further exploration and that was missing from our material were the topics of spirituality, faith, and death. And so here we are, exploring it. The objective of the lesson is to share our experience with you in hopes that that will then inspire further conversations on the topic from you. So as always, if you have questions or you want to contribute a layer 2 conversation, which we certainly hope you do, then you can message us on Slack. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan, and we're going to dig in, and he's going to host us.
Cool. Thanks, Ruth. That's I think that's an excellent kind of kickoff to the call. And thanks, Matt, and thanks, Nick, for joining this particular discussion. And I think it's going to be really interesting. So I think Ruth's kind of given us some good context. I'm going to add a few comments, and then maybe we can get into a little chat before we hit some stories. So spirituality, faith, and death, that's a lot of big, complex words, I guess. And, as I was thinking about this conversation, I kept coming back to this question: how does a person organize and respond to reality? Which is a difficult question, and one that different people are going to respond to in different ways. A religious person might organize reality in accordance with their religious principles. An atheist might cite a moral code that they've worked out for themselves. And a spiritual person might follow their felt instincts and intuitions. And really, none of these responses are categorically right or wrong. So the point of this discussion today is to explore the question of how do you organize reality. One might ask, how is this relevant to health? And I hope this will become clear as we dig in. For just a little bit more context, I'm in my mid-30s. I'm a trained accountant. I have no background in spirituality. And I left the corporate life of my 20s and 30s last year to take up a life on a farm, essentially. I'm not traditionally religious. In fact, I'd say I leaned agnostic or atheistic for most of my adult life. And I trusted in what could be proven scientifically true and was skeptical of kind of non-scientific or quote irrational proclamations. Over the past 2 years, though, I've learned through experience that science is not an arbiter of truth and meaning. It'll help guide a person, but it won't help answer big, important questions. Questions like, how do you treat a friend who has wronged you? How do you treat an enemy who has wronged you? What's the right way to pray? Is it reasonable to have faith in science, etc.? I found myself in this time pursuing meaning and values frameworks. And around this time, I found Gandhi's autobiography, in which he's very candid about his pursuit of God in his own life and his fearless explorations, I'd say, of Hinduism and many other religions. I find that today, most people fear conversations about these sorts of subjects. And I contrasted that to Gandhi's approach, in which he might greet someone on the street by asking them what they believe in. And this openness to spiritual and religious exploration was a reminder to me to explore this for myself. So fundamentally, this conversation touches on the subject of how one organizes reality for oneself. And this is the purpose really of religion in some sense, but religion is just a term meant to describe what we worship. In fact, for most of human history, there really wasn't much of a distinction between law and religion. And it was only once different cultures crossed paths that there needed to be a distinction between the two. And obviously people will describe these sorts of things in different terms. That's why the words faith and spirituality are so relevant. To address how this relates to health, I'd say that one worships what one values. And if you don't consciously choose what values to worship, then you risk worshiping false idols. And things like money, beauty, power, health, science, intellect, etc., might kind of qualify as any of those. And as the author David Foster Wallace kind of keenly and concisely points out, pretty much any of these forms of worship will probably eat you alive in the end. For example, if you worship money and possessions, then you'll always just feel like you never have enough. And that seems to me to be true. So to be of a sound and healthy mind, it's important to have explored your values, to be aware of what you worship, and to have a response to the question of how you organize reality. Now, as great as it would be if it were the case, the Footnerd program, I'd say, doesn't have answers to all of these big life questions. In the end, it's a process of continual personal exploration, conversations, and reflection being the right path forward. And it's also true that stories play an outsized role, I find, in helping us answer these big, important questions. So what we as hosts here propose to do as guides is really invite you in to listen to some of our personal spiritual stories. And through these stories, we hope to leave some breadcrumbs basically for foot nerds to follow in their own explorations. So anyhow, I think that's enough context for now. I'd like to kick it over and just ask, maybe follow on the point of why do you guys think that this is a relevant conversation for health? Or if there's any other context points you want to touch on.
I can go first.
I suppose I'll pass that to Nick and Matt maybe to weigh in.
Thanks, Ryan. Ryan really is the quarterback of all this. He's like the engineer. I mean, Ruth does her amazing intros and coordinates us, but I think Ryan really contributed the substance of why this was relevant and needed and worthwhile doing. So thank you, Ryan, for doing that. A fundamental question for me when I was thinking about this conversation was, how does spirituality relate to health? And that's kind of a different one. I had trouble answering that, because to me, actually, health is actually a spiritual journey. If I inject meaning into it along the way, then health is a spiritual journey. So how can I explain? It's hard to part those two things apart. And to look at spirituality, it's like, to me, spirituality fundamentally ends up being part of a quest for truth. right? A desire to understand myself and how the world works, and what's important, what do I value. And Ryan, you kind of mentioned it. Science is a great tool for seeking truth in the quantifiable world, but it's not that useful when it comes to answering those deeper questions, right? When it comes to deciphering, what do I actually value, how do I live in a pleasant life in harmony with nature and harmony with others. And for most of my life, I kind of had this negative impression, this negative prejudice with religions, and that they were dogmatic or very strict. But what I've come to realize in the past 2 years is really that religions are these ancient stories that embody wisdom that can help us come to the answer to those deeper questions. And when you start to realize, what do I value, what's important to me, I think part of spirituality is subordinating myself to a higher set of values and principles, right? The idea that the values I hold are the principles that I deem most important in life, that I'm constantly uncovering and determining, are more important than my personal desires. And so they guide action, and they guide me on how to respond to reality, like you said, Ryan. And to a large extent, my values are shaped by spiritual experiences I've had and continue to have in my life. And so to me, spirituality is really just a spiritual experience is one in which I deem has a high amount of meaning. And, health to me carries a lot of meaning. And so it's back to that same thing where health can be a spiritual journey if you inject meaning into it. And so I think health and spirituality are kind of these hard to separate, but intimately connected elements of health, at least in the way that I define health. So hopefully that gives a little bit of perspective from my part. I'd love to hear what other people have to say.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. But maybe Matt, did you want to weigh in on the relevance of these concepts to health, or any other kind of inputs you want to throw in at just to get in on the conversation a bit?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation today. I really like this concept of thinking about and talking about the own personal relationship to spirituality and religion. I think it has become a question that has asked me to think about what role does it play in my own life, because in a lot of ways it is somewhat a theoretical thing. I study it a lot. I enjoy stories. I tend to think, like Nick, that spirituality has this capacity to be present in so much of the human experience, the cultural and artistic ways in which we find meaning and find, I think, a peace of mind and a real presence in the world. At the same time, I think that spirituality and religion have all been somewhat at odds with me, and I look forward to seeing how others have maybe negotiated that, because I would argue that with health, there's compelling empirically supported evidence, and more of it, that deep religious experience, and I would say that's something that's largely lacking from my present way of being in the world. I would describe myself as somebody who's naturally and largely effortlessly spiritual in a certain way, but I would think of spirituality as somewhat more individualistic, and I've had a hard time articulating that type of relationship to more of a group of believers. I think we can get into that, especially in regards to my own story, but I think that those who do have that ability to connect and tap into that mystery of faith that allows one to be religiously, I think, bound to a certain moral code that is shared with others, a church, a type of regular ritualistic practice, which I don't have currently. I think that there's really compelling evidence that this helps immeasurably in regards to immune function, in regards to mental health, in regards to dealing with the anxiety right now that is so prevalent across, how do we find ways of being at peace in the world when we've offloaded so much of our cognitive kind of meaning making to all of the gadgets and things like that. So things like prayer and things like ritualistic practice with others seem to offer deep and really awesome types of benefits. to those who can summon and kind of negotiate that mystery of faith. And so I think that's the real thing. And it's been a challenge personally to think about how does one tap into that mystery of faith when in a certain way it seems like you either have it or you don't, or it seems like it's something that is, for me, it's been hard to move from the spiritual to the religious, to the sense of a collective ritualistic church-like experience with others. And I think that that's really, if one can do that, I think there's awesome benefits to be derived from that, but there's this big wall that separates it. So I think it's deeply tied to health, in regards to dealing with disease, dealing with loss, dealing with a lot of different things. Religious identifying people seem to have a benefit from the non-religious in a certain way.
Yeah, and I think there's I think a couple of things that kind of link. Well, as you both were talking, for me, I mentioned Gandhi a lot because I did take a lot from what he wrote, but his autobiography was titled Stories About My Experiments with Truth. And I thought that was such a well-titled document because he took sort of an experimental approach to what I would say a lot of, these explorations that we're talking about or alluding to. So he would go and attend faith services and different religions, Christian services or Muslim services, Islamic services. And I really, and without getting sort of attached to the dogma at the same time as doing that, he was very sovereign. Like he was still a sovereign individual in trying to understand for himself what his beliefs were. And I think to keep an eye on truth is something that carries through in my relatively limited experience. It's a theme in all of the major religious practices, is keeping your eye on what is true. And if you can kind of hold that, as that seems to me to be something of a fundamental ideal. And Nick, you mentioned that, and I thought it was really keen to bring that to light. And so you kind of keep an eye on truth while experimentally exploring different faiths and practices. And over time, that leads you towards something that I think is the right individualized process for each person. And again, there seems to be common elements to these types of things, which it's worth noting, if nothing else. Like community is big, song is big, prayer is big in all of the different practices that you look at. And I agree that there's a tendency to focus too much on the particulars of any one thing. It's like, well, let's find the practice which speaks to you, and that could mean going to different services or trying different approaches. And yeah, so there's a very individual element to all these things, which makes them interesting to explore.
I think one thing is this whole notion of being curious, right? It sounds like Gandhi was a very curious person, and the idea of being a seeker of truth with an open-mindedness and curiosity that you're not certain about anything, and that you don't necessarily need to fully go all in on one thing, because that comes at the expense of closing off all other things. And this idea that, by not ascribing to one specific religion, not that that is either good or bad, it gives you permission to explore freely, without judgment, without conflict, all of the other stories. And I think for me, I haven't read deeply into many of the stories, but at a superficial level, I'm familiar with sort of the core elements of them, and they're all very similar, right? It's like the blueprint for the lessons that are in these stories are so similar. It makes you wonder, like, did they all come to these conclusions independently? Are they telling different stories of the same fundamental truths, or are they all derived from the same source? And so it makes it exciting to learn about all the stories and how different people find meaning in this realm of spirituality. So I think just being curious for me is like, I don't want to be certain about anything, and I want to explore as widely as I can so I can have the best opportunity to discover the patterns and maybe the really core fundamental truths that seem to repeat. But yeah, I think it's this is a hard one to think about because it's such an ephemeral, nebulous thing that doesn't exist in the physical realm that we don't usually talk about. I think that's part of the difficulty of talking about this. We never talk about it candidly and openly and honestly with an intent to honestly share, our perspective. Because before doing this, I never actually had to understand deeply my own perspective. Right? It was like a bunch of disparate parts where I was like, I have spirituality, I do these things, these practices. But going through the exercise of trying to figure out what could I possibly say that would deliver value, or what can I share of my story, made me realize like, okay, this is a much more cohesive, concrete thing when I actually am forced to think about it. So I think that part of it's been cool so far.
Yeah, the other thing, Nick, that you mentioned, which I just wanted to draw out, was the link of health to spirituality, in terms of health being a process that can have spiritual ties. And I think that's a really, really kind of astute observation, because, but also not a surprise if you start to read, again, I'm a relative beginner, but a lot of different, I guess, faith leaders or religious practices talk about metaphysical purity, which is something that I'll talk a little bit about later. But like, it's not uncommon to say, well, you have to take care of your body in order to almost be permitted to see into some of the deeper truths. And the notion of carrying yourself, like looking after your 5 pillars in order to see the world clearly. Like, I think there's a link between those two things, and it's right not to say, well, it doesn't matter what you do for your body, if you're sort of spiritually healthy, you're good to go. It's like, no, you kind of need both. And so it's a worthwhile pursuit at the very least to, I think, take care of yourself physically and attend to the 5 pillars, because it's not just about physical. It's all that stuff is part of it.
Ruth, what are your thoughts?
So I guess for better or for worse, I don't really know how this all fits together, because this is like, I'm learning about this real time as we go along in this conversation. But the one thing in unpacking my own background and how faith, spirituality, and religion shaped my own life is, I see where I have imbalances now, which is, one of the self-disciplines in being a foot nerd is to always be curious and looking at your blind spots. So one thing that I'll share when we get into the stories is that I went to church a lot as a kid, but I was in a Mexican community and I spoke English. I didn't understand Spanish. So the rituals and the ceremonies and the building itself created a sense of awe because I didn't understand. So I was coming at my faith with a sense of understanding from a childlike felt perspective. And I'll share a little bit more later, but I guess like even in listening to how we're speaking about faith and spirituality and religion, I realized that I have never been a truth seeker. Like, I mean, if we're speaking candidly, I don't honestly care about the truth, to tell you the truth. Because I think I've been so emphatic about protecting my childlike wonder I mean, the one thing that I think I've carried from when I was a tiny little kid to a 54-year-old woman is some sense of fierce protection of lack of language around faith. And for all intents and purposes, the leaders, I'm fiercely skeptical of institution. So that and the way that health plays into this is like, it's kind of unfolding real time. Like, I think I definitely know there's a link, but I don't exactly know how to clarify it, personally speaking, yet.
Yeah, I think just one thing that keeps coming up is the difficulty of articulation. And I think that that's just something maybe to bookmark, because, well, this is something that I think Zen Buddhists do particularly well, is use like the concept of becoming aware, or of having like an awakening or an awareness moment. It's like that can be triggered by anything. And that's the concept of koan, is a Zen master will say some phrase which is kind of impossible to parse. Like it's a paradox of sorts in a lot of cases. It doesn't make literal sense, but it triggers something in the mind that is termed an awakening or an awareness moment. And I think the embracing of that uncertainty, it's like, you've got structure on one hand, and then you've got an uncertainty of response to structure, and an uncertainty around, how do I articulate what all this means? And, the point is that it's almost by definition impossible to fully articulate what spirituality means, but there's a feeling associated with it, which we can experience in moments, or we can, it seems like the end objective is to experience it in real time all the time. And whether that's possible, I'm not sure anybody can claim to know for sure, but like, I think it's okay to walk towards the uncertainty, I guess, is the point there. And I think that's why this conversation is centralized around stories and breadcrumbs, as opposed to like, here's what you need to do, because these, like, the uncertainty is what each individual needs to pursue and kind of resolve in their own way, I guess. And that's not a prescriptive, it's not something that anybody else can prescribe for you. It's something that people can talk about, and that makes the path clearer. But yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Just one little nugget that really stuck with me from Anthony DeMello has a book called Awareness. And one of the lines in there, he says that spirituality is about unlearning all the things we've been taught that we accepted. So this whole notion that spirituality is not necessarily a tool to answer your questions. It's a tool to help you question your answers. That to me was like a really profound element, where it's like, yeah, it's not a, health, truth is like health, right? Like Ruth, you're talking about how the hesitation to explore truth comes from the appreciation of wonder, of not knowing, of being like, the mystery is actually part of the excitement. But I think if you view truth as like, you can never actually know the truth. The goal is just to pursue it. Kind of like health, like you're never, quote unquote, you never reach the destination of health. You're always pursuing the quest to achieve excellent health, which is this ephemeral place that you just work towards. You never actually get there. And the satisfaction comes from actually just doing the things to work towards there, not to getting in some place. So yeah, the whole notion that spirituality is really just a tool to help you question your answers, not a place where you go to find the answers, to me was like, ooh, that's juicy.
Should we move on to the stories?
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think now would be a good time to leap in.
Okay.
So I kind of wrote the order as Ruth, then Nick, then Matt, then I'll be the last one.
Perfect clockwise based on my screen layout.
Yeah, actually. Oh, okay. No, it's not quite the same for me. I guess I'm in a different spot, but.
Okay, so yeah, this exercise was really informative and definitely took me into a lot of different directions. I figured that what I would do is just share some powerful memories from my life, throughout my life, that shapes who I am up until this point in my life and where I am now. And so I thought I would start from when I was a little kid. And when I was a little tiny kid, I had a super strong faith in God, a Catholic God to be specific. But that didn't really mean anything to me. Catholicism didn't mean anything to me. It's just that my family was that. So I was influenced most by my grandmother and my great granny, or my great grandmother. My great grandmother, when I'm having these initial memories, was in her mid to late 90s, and she was 4'8", and she was a tiny little Mexican woman with these long braids, and she looked like an elf. And I towered over her even at 10 years old. She was very creaturely and otherworldly to me, and she didn't speak English. So I lived in a large Mexican community, poor Mexican community in Denver, Colorado. And my grandmother had 10 kids. 6 of them were boys and 4 of them were girls. And we, because the adults in my life had extremely difficult adult problems like gambling, alcoholism, drug addiction, violence, etc., particularly the men, I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house. My mom was one of the people who had a big problem with alcohol. So I spent a lot of time at grandma's house. So the caveat here is that if I have to take the video away to tell the story and process, we agreed to do that ahead of time,
Yep.
but we agreed to share authentically. So please excuse me. So my grandmother's house was just super stable. And the women in that house, my grandfather went to work before I ever woke up, and he came home largely after I went to bed. I slept on a couch at my grandmother's house, and I was required when I was at her house to say bedtime prayers. So I'm going to tell you the bedtime prayer, because I never actually even thought about this prayer until Ryan gave us the exercise, and this is how it goes. Now I lay me down to sleep. I give the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I give the Lord my soul to take. So once I took that bedtime prayer to heart, because there was a lot of Jesus in that household. Like there were crosses everywhere. Those women were praying their asses off all the time, saying the rosary. That was a difficult life, and they were Catholic, so they said the rosary regularly, which was a prayerful meditation with beads. And then on top of that, they were always praying the rosary because everybody had major problems in the family. So needless to say, and everything was in Spanish, so I didn't really understand what was happening, but I knew that those women were the key to my safety. And when I got taught that prayer, I learned 2 very important things. And that is, number 1, now I lay me down to sleep, I give the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I learned that I wasn't guaranteed a next day. Number 2 is that the Lord must be some awesome dude, because if my grandmother was requiring me to offer my soul to him if I should die, then he must be okay. But then a 5, 6, 7 year old, throughout my childhood years, I would then slip into the nighttime darkness with those words in the back of my head. So in the nighttime, after my bedtime prayer, was where I developed a deep faith in God, because my childhood was very difficult. And so when I was frightened or worried or scared, I relied on those prayers, the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, and that bedtime prayer. And then whatever I could muster up with that rosary, just do what the smart ladies did in the house, just do that and you'd be safe. So, yeah, so those were some powerful memories. Like I was initiated into that life was not guaranteed. And I think that was powerful as a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old. Then the summer before my 7th grade, I moved from Denver, Colorado, Mexican poor Catholic community, to live the California dreamin' life with my aunt and uncle, who were like living large. They were like California hippies. They were so cool. And they adopted me. So they were extremely opinionated, liberal, agnostics. And when I went there, I liked them very much. I had everything that I could ever want or need, and I was safe to explore and be a kid. But they were extremely verbal about their belief systems. And so I felt a private shame about my deep faith in God. So what I learned in that household for the next years is that when I asked what agnostic meant, they told me that it was like somebody who doesn't disbelieve or who believes largely in God. And I think I was lucky in that sense, because that made sense to me. It's like, oh, well, I didn't go from one strong faith to another strange religion that I had no idea about the culture. So once I moved so living my 14-year-old life free from worry and having everything I needed, like spirituality, faith, and God fell off my radar unless I was deeply grieving privately. And then I returned to those childhood prayers, or I was sad, or I was scared, but I never told anybody about that deep faith in God. So it was just between me and God for all these years. And then when I moved out of my aunt and uncle's house and became an adult, I kind of just dabbled in, new age spirituality. Some of it made more sense because it accepted like who I was and who I was becoming, and my deep appreciation of like what is largely unknowable to me, but like a felt sense, like you were talking about, Ryan. And I guess where I am today is that I would still consider myself to be agnostic, leaning heavily towards not needing to know I guess like my honest feeling is like, I don't necessarily need to go, and this is a blind spot and an imbalance in my life because of trust, I think, because of trust in faith leaders and institutions and large bodies of people who, when they get together, usually don't make the best decisions for like big groups of people. But so I would say that I am skeptical about finding my sense of childlike wonder in church, where there's like a high level of organization, like where I have felt it. And the other thing is that from my childlike wonder and faith, deep faith in God, was largely based on fear. Like I could depend on God and faith to like make me feel safe again when humans couldn't do that. And that shifted to become more wholesome as I grew into an adult, in that like I would find that sense of well-being and celebration of God when I get my hands in the soil. Like I love gardening and I love working with dirt. When a large group of people sing together, a couple times at midnight mass on Christmas, when people sing specifically like certain music, like Silent Night together, I can feel this sense of cohesion and I can feel a sense of godliness there. Anything that has to do with moving together, I teach yoga, and there have been times when a group of people are moving and breathing as one unit and one breath, where I am certain that there is God there. I'm more skeptical of finding that in church, and my blind spot is that I haven't been to very many churches, but the ones that I have been to feel quite oppressive and rigid, and I don't like to sit. I'm a foot nerd, and I don't like to listen to people talk about God in the way of like politics and money and what is right or wrong and what I need to do to go to heaven or hell. Like, I guess because, you hear this a lot, like children who have had like deeply troubled backgrounds don't have the same kind of relationship to faith that maybe adults do. And that's the only thing I can think of. Like, well, why? I feel so ill-equipped to almost be having these conversations because I just feel childlike and ill-equipped when it comes to the conversation. But I do think it's important to express, the sentiment. So I think that, I have recognized imbalances in my ideas, and I'm willing to explore them. And and I realize that there's a lot to learn. So thanks for having the conversation and giving us the opportunity to share them.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Ruth.
Yeah.
That was, I think that's how we learn, right? Through story. And I think you did it sounds like some powerful moments in your life. And thanks for sharing them authentically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So my story as a spiritual person actually only started like a year and a half ago. Before then, I went to Catholic school when I was younger. Religion was always presented as a chore, something I was forced to learn about. It was never something I was interested in. I was not a good sitter as a kid, and I have two younger twin brothers, and we're my mom is a saint, I think, because we are little a-holes most of the time when we were younger, I think. So bringing us to church wasn't exactly a high priority, but my grandmother was religious and would go to church every Sunday. So when we visited her, out of respect for her going to church and having her routine, we would go. But it was never something I really found meaning in. And I was always a little bit uneasy with the conditionality of certain things. Like, in order to go to heaven, you have to do these things. If you don't, you're going to a terrible place. And I was like, well, that's something weird about that. I didn't like the conditionality of it. So I would never have considered myself religious or even spiritual, although I was always kind of curious about, like, what does spiritual mean? And I think I got turned off by people who were really overtly expressive of being spiritual, and I didn't relate to them, right? They were like, not even hippie, because I would say I'm more or less a hippie, but these people were they just turned me off in the way that they acted, and I felt it was like a weird costume they were wearing. So I never really related to it. But in February 2021, I went on a trip to Costa Rica. And that was like the most significant moment in my life in terms of becoming a spiritual person, because it updated my perspective on death, a really profound experience that made me think about death in a different way. It put prayer on the menu as something that is meaningful and that I could relate to. And so I think that experience literally fundamentally changed who I was as a person who acknowledged spirituality as an important part of life. So on that trip, I was fortunate to be able to spend some time with an elder. His name is Quatley. He lives in Texas, and he's part of the Mexica lineage. And he does plant medicine ceremonies, sweat lodges. And so he essentially goes around. He's what they call a roadman. So he'll go around different parts of the world. He's traveled to like 40 different countries, and he does ceremonies to where he's invited to run ceremonies. So on this trip, we did 2 peyote ceremonies and a sweat lodge. And I had done a sweat lodge before, but never with Quatley, and it was very different. And so, just to paint a picture of what these ceremonies are, these peyote ceremonies, basically you spend a full day building an altar out of earth and with flowers, and basically like for 6 hours straight, a group of like a dozen people are building this very ornate, beautiful, geometrically aligned with where the sun rises and sets setting. So there's lots of energy that goes into it, right? And I think the energy that went into building this altar, this setup, is actually part of what imbued this ceremony with meaning, right? I was like, wow, these people are spending a lot of time taking, like, they would even put these little beans in a design around the half moon altar, and they would place every single bean with this level of precision and meaning that I was like, wow, this is incredible to watch. And just to be part of it was awesome. And even the day before, I spent like 4 hours debarking pieces of wood that were going to be used, because basically this peyote ceremony, they run a firekeeper works all night to keep a beautiful fire going. And then Quatley would come up and make designs in the embers at intermittent periods. So like just all these things, this energy we're putting into just the build up to this thing before it even happens was incredible. And so basically you sit up all night singing, praying, getting well, which really just means purging. They just call it getting well. Probably sounds a little bit nicer. And then Quatley would basically share ancient wisdom from his culture. And it was very unique because it was a hard task to stay up the whole night sitting up, right? If you were lying down or sleeping, he would politely and lovingly come over to you, wake you up, and remind you that tonight's the night that we pray all night. We don't sleep. And everyone has a morning meal at sunrise. And even during the ceremony, like one lady was having a really hard time with her life, and she told her story, and everyone prayed for her. And what really hit me with prayer was this: at the start of the ceremony, basically we all pray for 2 minutes out loud. And so I didn't really know what that was. I'm like, I don't even know what praying is. Like, what do I say? So I'd kind of try and listen to the people around me, what they were saying. And, maybe like 45 seconds in, most people are quiet because they ran out of things to say. And Quatley would just kept going. And, he was basically saying, I'm thankful for the moon and the ocean, and thank you, Great Spirit, for giving us the wisdom to make wise choices and to live in alignment with nature. And I just kind of listened to all these things, and I'm like, wow, those are things that I could say, because I actually agree wholeheartedly with what he's saying. We should appreciate these things. We should appreciate life. I just didn't have the verbiage or the understanding of what prayer was to do it. And so from that point on, that was essentially the inception point, where every day before I drink coffee, and even during morning meditation, I'll say a prayer to thank Great Mother or Great Spirit, or bless people I know in my life that love me and that support me. And so I think the big thing that happened for me there was this whole idea that you don't have to be religious to pray. And that was like this big, powerful moment of insight for me to be like, I don't have to actually identify with a certain religion in order to say a prayer to be grateful for what we have. And that meal in the morning, they basically serve fruit, corn, and meat. And the day before, we essentially blessed the goat that we were going to be harvesting for meat. And that was a really profound experience with me for death, because the lady that owned the property, this was a goat that she had lived with and fed. And essentially the people that worked on this property brought the goat over, and the goat was kind of like struggling, like it didn't know what was going on. So it was kind of like struggling, and she started crying. And I started tearing up. I'm like, this is kind of sad. You know, we're blessing this goat, but this goat is going to be killed. And, you know, Quatley sort of said in this calm voice, he said, you know, this goat is giving itself up so that we can consume it and continue to live, right? This goat, and he kind of asked the lady who owned the land, like, did this goat live a good life? Yes. And went through these questions. And at the end, I was like, this isn't sad at all. This is a beautiful thing. And the fact that we're blessing this goat and giving meaning to the fact that it's giving its life for all of us, and essentially will continue on, you know, the flesh of this animal will essentially be interweaved with our flesh when we consume it. And essentially that goat will continue on in all of us because it contributed to keeping us alive. And it just made me think of this idea that in order for life to continue, death must occur. And if you imbue meaning to the death that has to occur and recognize it as a necessary part of life, then death actually isn't sad, but we should acknowledge it as an important part and like an important element for life to continue, and be grateful for the fact that this animal is giving up its life or offering its life to us so that we can continue to survive. So I think, you know, and from that trip on, every morning I say a prayer. I'll bless people that I see on the street that are having a hard time, you know, even just in my own mind. Quatley told a story about the Toltecs, which is like this ancient culture that lived in harmony with peace. They lived in alignment with nature. And on that trip, before I left, I bought this little granite Toltec head. And this is my physical artifact, like reminder to always seek to live in alignment with nature. One thing about the Toltecs is they created these beautiful statues and sculptures out of stone. So they created beauty out of nature, in alignment with nature, and lived a peaceful life. So I think from that trip on, I picked up on the fact that death had a totally new meaning for me. Prayer was something that could be done without needing to be religious, and was actually a really important practice to build meaning and be grateful for the fact that we are able to wake up every morning and have another day. And then it also just made me think more about this concept of living in alignment with nature, living in alignment with other humans, with the natural environment. And I think from that point on, I considered myself a more spiritual person because of these practices that I picked up that had new meaning, and that I've been able to continue to do every day, and continue to build meaning into them. So that's kind of my story of spirituality. And, you know, obviously the story is still unfolding, and I'm still very new to this. I haven't been able to go back and see Quatley again because we haven't really been able to travel. But as soon as I can, I plan to go back. And ideally, I would love to go once a year, because just being able to hang out and have meals with someone who has so much, he doesn't say very many words. This is one of the things I picked up on. He doesn't say very many words. Every word he says is incredibly potent, and oftentimes serves not to give you an answer, but to basically politely express that what the question you're asking is silly. And that, you know, he loves to say everything's light. Everything is light. That's his thing. And he's like, goes down to the atomic level. Like, he's a really smart guy. He actually has he's very well educated in all these different topics, mostly history. So he knows history really well. And so he's got this balance of being an intellectual, having a deep understanding, loves to read, loves music, but also has this deep understanding of ancient cultural wisdom that allows him to harness this intellectual understanding in a way that actually makes it not boring and meaningless. So yeah, that's my story. And my life's better now that I do these things, significantly better, right? Like even during this Freedom Convoy thing, when things were getting insane in my life, like every day I prayed multiple times a day. And if I didn't have that outlet to be able to just connect with something bigger than myself, it would have been a lot harder. I would have had a lot more suffering. So, and if anything, prayer makes the suffering meaningful enough that it's worth enduring and makes life meaningful. So yeah, that's my story.
Thanks, Nick. That's awesome. Yeah, there's lots. So far, there's a lot that I am like wishing that I could explore, that we could explore further.
We'll have some good layer 2 conversations.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's future stuff to be mined, I guess. But yeah, maybe over to you, Matt, if you want to pick up from here.
All right, thank you. I mean, yeah, this is great. I think it's so much food for thought personally that it's challenged me in a lot of ways. I struggle. Let me start off by saying that I pray rarely. I rarely pray, and hearing Nick's experience about the way that it improves your life and that the quality, the like eating something delicious or doing something, thinking of prayer not as a way of getting somewhere, but of like making your life, more awesome. It's something that just preparing for this call has pushed me in a way to start to ask why. And having said that, I rarely pray. It's interesting that I grew up in a very Catholic family. Similar truth, there were socioeconomic qualities associated with that. I come from an Italian, Portuguese American family, and growing up in the central part of California, it's an agricultural area. It's tied to this like love of the land and being outside and this quality of work and all those things that were just so natural growing up as a young person. It was almost like a type of air that you breathed, similar to Ruth. There wasn't really any type of creed or orthodox list beliefs you had to buy into until a bit later. But when I was very young, it was a type of natural way. I mean, I wasn't overly enthusiastic or not. I mean, it was just something that you did, going to church. I was an altar, meaning I participated in the Roman Catholic types of masses and did things.
Perfect.
Okay, so when I was an altar boy as a young kid, I was just naturally doing things. I was participating in kind of like the daily practice of the church in a way that was kind of like going to school or kind of like doing other types of things. Growing up in the country, it was something that I always did. It was something that I wasn't super like. I didn't have I didn't have an emotion or a type of preference about it. It was just a part of life. And I remember. I mean, I surely said prayers as a young person, the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary and the typical types of Catholic prayers. But there are other prayers that I remember when I was preparing for this call, because I used to have to go outside a lot, and negotiating my relationship to the dark was always something as a small child. I have to walk across the orchard that we lived in and like take care of animals and feed the animals outside. And I remember negotiating that sense of fear by praying and creating these types of spontaneous prayers that kind of blended together all these different aspects of a little bit of kind of Catholic identity, but also some of the sing-song ways, I guess, of a childlike awe that Ruth was talking about. And kind of out of nowhere, I mean, I'm sure I haven't uttered this prayer in 15 or 20 years. As I was thinking about it, it started to come back to me in large little phrases, and I was able to think of it in quite naturally, just because it had been so ritualistic and a part of my lived experience so long. So the prayer that I used to say is from a very small child when I have to go outside and deal with, feeding the animals and walking across the orchard and helping out. My parents had a chicken farm, and we had a lot of animals outside. So I would look up at the sky and I would say, the starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I may, I wish I might have this wish I wish tonight. And then I would say, I wish that I can have a long life and a happy life, and that my family can have a long life and a happy life, and we'll all live together for a long time, and we'll all have a long and happy life even after we separate. We'll all have good jobs and good retirement plans. And if it's not too much, please put a little extra for me to become a professional baseball, basketball, football, hockey, or tennis player, or represent my country in the Olympics. This prayer is directed to God. Thank you for everything I have, and please keep on everything coming the same. And I would say this every single night at a much faster rate, and it just came back to me, and it kind of tapped into a type of person that almost seemed lost, that I no longer am in a certain way. Having said that, I don't pray, and as I got older, when I moved away and I started going to university, it kind of became just something where I no longer lived in this community. I no longer lived in the country. I lived in the city. I was doing other things. I was playing college sports. I was developing new relationships. And so my experience to this community of believers and to the church just naturally faded away. And with it, there was really a withering of prayer, so that I no longer even said any of the Catholic prayers without having any crisis of belief or spirituality. I wasn't, a type of, I guess, a stereotypical idea of Catholicism of being deeply riddled by guilt, or, having this crisis of faith in which you have to reject things and look at your past as this error of kind of how you used to be, how you used to think about things. It was really just a replacement with a different way of being, and with it, a different way of using language. And with it, I would say a less balanced way of using language, because I can easily access those spiritual types of qualities. But the hardest thing for me is to be able to actually utter them, and to, as we've said here, the actual act of, I don't even pray in the sense of like having a quiet conversation to myself, because of the almost like foreignness of it, and the way that the high level of skepticism I have to even going to church, to listening to people talk about religion in a way that to me seems very, very lacking in mystery, very lacking in that type of childlike awe that Ruth was talking about, and the ability to tap into prayer as this life-enhancing thing like Nick was talking about is almost completely lost to me. And now, as we get to the experiments portion of this conversation, it's something that I hope to in turn have my own practices to try out, because I love the stories. I study and I read different aspects of the Bible, and I have my preference for certain celebrations. I like Pentecost because of the fact that the Holy Spirit is said to have come down and filled the kind of room in which the apostles were congregating with this fiery wind that caused this speaking in tongues, and almost like this incomprehensible but like lived experience of vibrant vocality, like talking and like saying things in a way that brought them out and brought them to life and renewed a type of relationship to language that to me has always been super problematic. At the same time, with the withering of prayer, I felt that my own relationship to my family has been oftentimes very problematic. I feel a type of hard-heartedness in regards to my family, my mother and my father, because of ideas I never was able to identify in them, a powerful model of like belief or spiritual community. And I feel like the way that I talk to them, the way that I feel around them has been very guarded and very linguistically harsh. And it's only a couple moments linked to death that that was kind of cracked open. One of them was recently when my 95-year-old grandmother died, which was my mom's mom. And I was asked to give the eulogy. And so I was sitting there and prepared to go up, and I just felt a lot of different emotions. And then they played the Ave Maria, which is one of my favorite songs. I mean, there's so many things about the Catholic Mass that I deeply enjoy. The iconography, the different senses, the fact that you're moving about, that you're getting up, that you're standing, that you're kind of eating and drinking, all those things I've kind of cut myself off from. But being back in church occasionally, I slip into them fairly easily. And hearing the Ave Maria, which has always been one of my favorite Catholic hymns or songs, I mean, I just started welling up. And when I got up to use the language simply to describe my feelings and the kind of text that my parents had largely written about my mom's mom, I could barely make it through it. I paused repeatedly, and it was the exact same experience that I had actually lived through 20 years prior when my mom's dad passed away, and I'd given the eulogy for that as well. I mean, I just like the fact that I rarely pray. I rarely cry in public. It's not something I allow myself to do, and it's something that I wish that I could do. I guess like I wish I could pray. And when I cried in front of all those people and barely was able to get through those words, it was a deeply cathartic experience because of so many things. The kind of a relationship to home in the church that I grew up in, before my family, before my parents, who I continue to have a difficult relationship with in a lot of ways. But also because of the fact that I was sincerely, like Nick was saying words which if I'm not sincere about something, if I'm having a conversation with somebody and they don't seem to be listening to me, I'll just shut up. I'm very obstinate. I'm very deliberate in how I think about language, oftentimes a little bit too severe, too rigid in that type of way. But I feel like a lot of those things I was a little bit more generous, a little bit more open, a little less guarded. And just it felt like it was a kind of a bringing together of a lot of different aspects of sincerity with language in that lived place of faith, which I still don't have a strong connection to, and I hope to. And I'm more optimistic about it now, having heard so many of the stories today. And so that's my story for now. I could say a lot more, but those are the most important points, and I just am thankful to have had this opportunity to share it with you so far.
Thanks for sharing, Em. That was
Thanks, Matt.
That was beautiful.
Okay, I'll kind of close things off, I guess. And it's funny, I kind of come up with a story to talk about, and there's lots of things that are entering my head listening to you guys that I think different stories would be interesting. But I'll stick with what I originally planned, and maybe time to write out some experiences that I've had, because I think it's like I haven't really got that down as a lived experience in a way that is crystallized, and I think writing is a good way to get that out. Anyhow, I'll go kind of with what I had planned. And also, funnily enough, mine's about prayer. And we've talked a lot about prayer on this call, and it's kind of interesting, the themes and the threads that kind of tie these things together. And I kind of am going to limit it to just like one kind of brief thing, as opposed to telling much of my kind of the lead up and stuff like that. But anyhow, I'll go ahead. So last year, and I've only been kind of exploring my kind of faith and spirituality in a religious / non-religious sense for the past year and a half, 2 years as well, similar to Nick, I'd say. Last October, I left my job, as I mentioned, and it was also at this time that due to like the COVID rules and stuff in Canada, I wasn't really able to engage in any physical communities. And I was also partway through the Footnerd program. And because of that and many other reasons, I'd say, like with the freedom of not having to go to work or a corporate job, I was in pretty good shape across all the 5 pillars, like food, mind, sleep, movement, and to the extent that I could, community. They were all in really well tended, I'd say. And, it was at this time that I was starting to lean towards prayer, and I was doing a lot of reading of texts, as I said, values frameworks, but I didn't really know where to start, at least as far as prayer was concerned. And then I kind of came across my late grandfather's Bible, and he was somebody that meant a lot to me, and I try to model some of my best, like, good behavior after him. And so I kind of made a commitment then to read the Bible, because I never had. And it's a important text, whether in the history of the world, I guess, whether religious or not. And I read Christ's Sermon on the Mount really for the first time in earnest, and the words I found really left a deep mark on me. And in Matthew, the book of Matthew, chapter 6, he speaks of prayer. Christ does, and he's quite clear. If you kind of extract out the actual instructions, don't make your prayer in the synagogues or on the street corners, i.e. in public. Go to your room, close your door, and pray to the unseen Father in secret. And the words that he refers to, well, he tells you what words to use too. Referred to as the Lord's Prayer, which, our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. And, it's a compelling prayer, I think. And I objectively. And so I heeded the instructions. I said, all right, I'm going to try. And on November 26th, I wrote down the day. I woke up. I went to the window in my bedroom. I cleared my mind. I knelt on the ground and I recited those words. And, I have said those words before. When I was younger, I did go to church, but I stopped at a certain point. And I understood that saying a prayer is one part of it, and the other part is actually pausing to listen for the response to the prayer. So I waited probably 30 seconds. I was a little impatient, and I stood up and I started making my way to the door. And at that point, a man's voice, not my own, entered my mind and said these words: "Go forth, my son." And I almost didn't catch it. I was just walking, and I just almost kept walking. And then I stopped and I was like, well, hold on a second. Like, just what the heck made those words appear in my mind right now? And was that the word of the Lord? Was that just some random neuronal firing in my brain? Or was it something that maybe I'd heard the last day and I forgot and it just came up? And then I was kind of like, well, did the answers to those kinds of questions even matter? So, I'm not sitting here going to make the claim that God spoke to me. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But what I will say is that for whatever reason, when I prayed, those words came into my mind. And as a cautious guy who was living in a comfortable shell without many responsibilities at the time and tending to my 5 pillars on my own time, but not really putting myself out there in the world, those words were what I needed to hear in that moment. And wherever they came from, they had meaning. So I guess I decided to have some faith in those words, and I've kept them in the front of my mind ever since, really. And I consider it no surprise that a lot of the great things that have happened in my life since then were influenced by keeping that in mind and by putting it into practice with good faith and with virtuous intentions. So, that's my story. I think I want to kind of sum up what the takeaway, at least the takeaway to me. So let's call what I experienced just a banal, random firing of neurons in my brain. Of course, these sorts of things happen all the time in our mind. And the question might be, when do we listen? And what sort of prominence do we assign to the things that we hear, or these neuronal firings? And how can we trust what our brain tells us? And, as far as I can tell, according to, I guess, spiritual thinkers, a lot of spiritual thinkers, the answer is to some extent, we purify ourselves before that which we can't understand. And then we trust in what we hear in those moments of purity. And I guess just to bring it back to the Foot Nerd program, like, it is an experience of attaining a sort of balanced metaphysical purity. And I think I needed that process, as well as an openness, kind of in parallel, an openness to spirituality and religious thinking, in order to achieve value from prayer, as I did in that moment. So I would love to go on and add other stories about, some of the practices that I've been able to engage in, and some of the ceremonies that I've been kind of privileged enough to experience. I think there's been a lot of music and song and dance in the last year at, like, opportune moments that have meant an awful lot to me, and I think meant an awful lot to many of us who have found ourselves in isolating positions. But we can save those stories for another day. So I'll pause there.
Consider that an open invite to anyone listening to reach out to Ryan to explore or share more stories.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Ryan. That's pretty powerful. I mean, I think, it's like, I can relate to the process you went through, where it's like, did that just happen? Did I just make that up? And does it even matter if I made it up? Like, the fact that it happened, it's like, you then have a fork. It's like, what meaning will I ascribe to this? And the funny part about that is, it's largely up to me what meaning I put into this.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, an event happens. You can choose to not pay attention. You can choose to pay attention. You can choose to imbue slight meaning or huge meaning into that thing that is neutral until you decide what to do with it. And I think part of spirituality is knowing there's an outlet to imbue meaning into the mundane of your own volition, because it makes your life better. And like, that was something for me, before my exposure to prayer at the peyote ceremony, I had never been given permission to say what I wanted to. It was always, this is the prayer. These are the words. I don't like being told what to do in general. And so it was always forced, right? It's like, I'm being told to do this. I don't even know the words. I'm just trying to follow along. This isn't a good experience. I don't feel it's authentically me saying this. I'm just reciting something. Whereas when Kali was like, just say whatever comes to your mind. And hearing him say things for like 2 minutes populated a template in my brain of the things I could be grateful for. And we're attaching words to how I could express that. And from then on, it's like, prayer was something before, and then it was something after, and they were totally different things. And my prejudice of prayer before, of it being something I couldn't relate to because I was being told to do it, and I couldn't, it was never me saying it, was just me reciting someone else's words, to, I can just say something that I deem meaningful, that I truly believe in, that makes my life better. And that prayer, like, it's a new definition of prayer. And all of a sudden, prayer was something I deeply related with, which beforehand was not even something on my radar. So I think we create meaning. I think, Ruth, I learned this from you. Meaning is there if you create it. If you don't create meaning, a life devoid of meaning is actually a pretty hard life. Mm-hmm. And the decision to create meaning in our lives is actually totally up to us. And to me, it makes for a much more pleasant life. So.
I guess we're coming to like closing comments and experiments and stuff. So maybe like we'll do what we did before with Matthew. We'll all turn our videos off and mute ourselves when he speaks, because that worked pretty well.
Yep.
The one thing I just wanted to say, like, in all of your conversations, the preparation for prayer, I just want to reiterate that. The clearing a space, the making of an altar, the clearing of your mind, the going in secret, for me, always in secret at night when I was the most vulnerable, would I pray. And like Matthew going into the orchard and his, okay, can I just say I've never heard that prayer before? And I don't know, it's just, I mean, like that's hilarious and beautiful, you know, about like, please can I represent my country in the Olympics? But I think that purification process and the clearing the container before prayer is combined with the prayer. And I've so much been hasty in my prayers, like, please give me the thing and give it to me now, whether it's protection, like you're the person who, you're the all-knowing being that can provide this, whether it's protection or bounty, and I need it now, can you give it to me? Without even like truly having that reverence and that honor. It's like an obstinate child, you know? So I think that just bringing extra attention to the parts where you talked about preparation before the peyote ceremony and preparation before each of these ceremonies.
Ruth, do you want to share an experiment recommendation?
Okay, so I will share. So I actually didn't, when I was talking with Matthew about this, I was like, I don't have any experiments because
That's okay,
I don't like it. And then, but I had talked about the garden. I mean, like, I think my deep, deep connection to something bigger than myself privately really happens when my hands are in the soil. And so I guess my one experiment would be like, can you go to do some gardening with the intention of knowing God there, or the intention of like preparing your garden in the way that you would prepare for prayer, like do your gardening as if it were a prayer. In fact, I wrote a poem about this one time, and I think I'll probably share it in the resources.
Awesome.
Nice.
So the experiment I would recommend is my favorite ritual that I am most, that I uphold. It's not an option. It's not negotiable for me not to do it. And I made sure to pair this with something I do every day that I look forward to, which is I have a coffee in the morning and I enjoy that coffee. And so there's already like a sense of meaning or looking forward to this. So my ritual, which I encourage people to try even just once, and it's going to feel weird the first time you do it. The first dozen times I did it, it felt weird, but now it feels truly authentic. And it's before I drink any coffee, I take 6 slow, very deep breaths. And I even like trace my thumb up when I breathe in and out when I breathe out. And if I'm rushing the breaths, I start over. And I often start over because it's like, that's like the lead up to anchoring myself in the present so that when I say the words, they actually are meaningful. I'm not just saying it to rush through it or to check the box off. So I take 6 slow, deep breaths. And then I essentially say a prayer to a great mother and great spirit to thank them for, to hopefully get the wisdom to make wise choices in my life and for the people around me, to thank great mother for allowing us all to live in harmony, to, you know, and I'll say a blessing for my mom or for my family or for anyone I know who's having a hard time. And it's not a long thing, but every day before I drink coffee, I take 6 deep breaths and I say a prayer with whatever I find meaningful in that day. And then I finish by saying, thank you for the people who helped bring this coffee into my cup. And sometimes I'll go deep into that. It's like the person who tended the soil, who planted the beans, who harvested the beans, who roasted the beans, who packaged the beans, who built the coffee maker, like in as much detail, because it really makes me realize, like, I drink this coffee, but I often, for a long time in my life, didn't realize how many things people in the world had to do so I could drink this coffee. And just thinking of those layers makes me so thankful that there are people doing those things so I can drink that coffee. And that just, it's like a different way of starting my day. So that would be my experiment to suggest, is if you drink coffee or if you do anything that you enjoy every day, pair it with some form of anchoring in the present and then some sort of prayer to, even if you just say thank you for that thing that you're about to do, that's a good start. That's probably how I started for a long time. So maybe an experiment worth trying. Let's go to M.
All right.
Okay, thanks everyone for helping me out through my technology kind of issues here. Hopefully this comes through. I really appreciate the kind of model that Nick put out there of calling prayer by this positive use of language, which all of a sudden has kind of dawned on me just in the past couple of days of thinking about this, of how unsatisfying so much of my language use is, how it can name things and it can analytically dissect stuff. And I use language in a lot of positive ways. I like to play the guitar and sing, but I do it so little, just like I pray so little in this positive, nourishing sense. So I would ask for those who have a problem with language like I do, like saying things that I don't want to say, that oftentimes I was forced to at a certain point. Like not all of my not all of my youth was positive Catholic type of experience. At a certain point, I was just like, I'm not going to say that because it's not sincere. And at a certain point, I just left it. And just remembering this kind of weird, highly unorthodox, mishmash of things that I love to do, and kind of like the retirement plan. I look back and like this way I put together this thing with the sing-song quality of the star, focusing it and creating a ritual, like a trigger of sorts. We talk about all the small little habits that you have in life, like using that as a doorway to get past that or get over that threshold of the mystery of faith. St. Ignatius, I teach at a Jesuit school, so I've kind of gleaned a lot, kind of despite the fact that I haven't been actively searching, but St. Ignatius is said to have expressed the fact that whatever you enjoy doing the most, there is where God is. And I just remember as a child, I loved being outside. I loved playing sports specifically. Even though I never played hockey, I loved to watch it. So I guess at some point I envisioned myself potentially being an NHL superstar, or those aspects of my youth, and recognizing that and calling it by prayer, as opposed to just saying, well, it's the Lord's Prayer or it's these other prayers if you grow up in a Catholic tradition. But as another, very famous Catholic writer, and I've always thought about this without ever doing it, it's always been at the level of theory. Pascal has said, if you don't understand, and Pascal is famous for his wager, saying like, what do you have to lose? You have everything to gain by believing. And yet, if you don't believe, the way to believe is not to first find that trigger of belief, but it's to get on your knees, to move your lips. And through that ritual, you will discover belief, is more or less his idea. And I think in a lot of ways, it's as simple as that. And at the same time, calling that act a prayer, as Nick had said, being a creative act of expression, of a positive use of language, and just this allowing these things to flow through in this joyful, spontaneous, childlike way, for me, is one way of overcoming a deep, problematic, I think unsatisfying blockage in regards to the use of language and how it shapes so much of religious experience and shut the door on so much positive, life affirming, life enriching things. So kind of doing those things, calling it prayer and making it a daily practice.
Beautiful.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think I love the ones that the experiments you guys are suggesting. I think for me, the last year, it's funny, the circumstances around the pandemic and everything certainly had their adverse effects, but it pointed me towards services, and I hadn't been to church in years, but at a certain point there weren't too many places that you could go where people were gathering, and even a lot of churches closed during the pandemic. But it was like I needed to go somewhere just to be around people. And when I went, I was terribly afraid. I was like, what am I doing? Why am I here? But once I'd gone, I found myself happy to have gone, and I'd wished that I had done it sooner. So what I would suggest as an experiment is for people to seek out, basically look up what faith services, communities, practices are in and around you. Be open to whatever denomination it is. It doesn't have to be the one that you grew up with. It doesn't have to be, it can be anything, right? Any congregation of people that are practicing something in faith. probably they have a website, so go on the website and read what they believe in, because often it's posted, and find one, maybe two that really resonate with you, and then go and attend. And I think keep it at arm's length, because I think that's important. But at the same time, be open, be humble, be inquisitive, be friendly, and I'd say follow along. A lot of these things have a music element or a prayer element, and I've gotten a lot from singing in a group, which I hadn't done in my entire adult life. And I mean, how magical it is to be like, even if the words don't mean anything to you, just to harmonize your voice with other people is beautiful. And you can really I've really gotten a lot out of that. So that's my experiment. Find some service or practice or congregation, give it a try, and just see what happens, and reflect on that after you've given it a look, and and then go from there.
I think this
Okay.
notion of having a curious openness is actually what allows you to even enter into uncovering what spirituality is, right? Like
Yeah.
for me, for most of my life, spirituality was a door. I never even opened the door because I thought I knew what was on the other side.
Mhm.
And I figured I'm not the kind of person that walks through that door, because I'm not the kind of person that wants what's on the other side. And sure enough, what was on that other side, no one can discern what's on the other side of that door except for you. You actually create what's on the other side of that. And
Right.
so the idea that, before I said a prayer for the first time, I wasn't the kind of person who prayed. But then I did it. And even if it felt weird, I was now someone who prayed or has prayed once. So I think just the openness to being curious that what you think it is, it might not be. And that alone, and just being open to experience, and not just doing it, but like committing with your soul that I am just going to see this the way it is, not the way I am, because the way I am is not someone who prayed. So if I go into prayer and it's as someone who doesn't pray, clearly it's not going to resonate. So I think just the openness, radical openness to being like, I want to experience this with my full presence to see what there is, and knowing full well that I don't know what's to come, but it could be interesting. So I would just encourage people to just be open to it. Like Ryan said, walk into somewhere, go to something, try a prayer, and just see what's there for you.
Which is essentially being a foot nerd, right? Like it's in our manifesto that you are kind, you're curious, you're open-minded, you are questioning everything as you go along, but you recognize always that the nature of science is looking for your blind spots, that you're always proving yourself wrong. So should we close it out?
M's an honorary foot nerd, by the way. So
He's more of a foot nerd than I am. So should we, any other closing comments, or do you think we'll end it here?
Yeah, I think that's good. I feel really good about what we covered, and I hope everybody got a lot out of this. I certainly feel enriched by the experience of being here and listening to what you guys had to say, and of vocalizing some of this stuff myself. So thank you guys so much. And hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And
that's right. And remember that listening to this is proof of work. It's lesson 30. And thank you again for committing to your health.
there we go.
Love you all. Ciao.
Ciao for now.
Thank you, guys.